All right, everybody, let's go ahead and jump right in. I did not script this out or anything since we were going to go through some of this in class. But remember that we actually started out this unit talking about the Stanford prison experiment. We actually may have discussed the chapter on jails first. I'm trying to recall, but either way, you want to make sure that you do review the Stanford prison experiment. There's a couple of links that are online that will point you to videos where you can get a good summary. They don't go over this experiment in the chapters that you're assigned, but it is in your textbook. It's in chapter 14, and so it's in the glossary as well. But the reading that I put online that relates to this is something that the two main researchers wrote 25 years afterwards. And really, you want to remember this phrase, the power of the situation, and how it can overwhelm individual traits that basically people bring into a prison setting with them or a jail setting with them, right? So this is kind of getting at the importation idea or model that is discussed later in chapter 9 versus the deprivation model, right? That's also discussed in chapter 9. I think I use the terms model because that's importation and deportation model. Your textbook doesn't actually put model on the end of those terms, but it all refers to the same thing. One thing that they focused on in that reading that's online is what the specific effects were that they found, and then the deterioration of all the relationships, basically all the interactions over time. And remember that the prisoner's intent to do harm increased, even though they actually became more passive and less likely to act out, but they were more likely essentially to want to act out. And that's why Zimbardo referred to this experiment when he put out the videos as quiet rage. They also go through at the end and outline 6 lessons from the Stanford prison experiment. And so that middle piece in the reading is not that important, just because they are looking at data that is relevant at the time that they put this article out, but that's kind of data that we've looked at in the beginning of the semester. Okay. This point about institutions taking on a life of their own, we'll kind of come back to that when we see and go over the inmate subculture and things that are related to that. We had also talked a little bit about the goals of punishment, goals of sentencing, and philosophies of punishment to frame this unit. And I gave you the reminder here that comes from the director of the National Council on Crime and Delinquency that yes, all of those philosophies of punishment and goals of sentencing are important, but there is the everyday hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute concern over managing behavior for security purposes. And that kind of takes precedence just in the short term versus these goals of sentencing and philosophies of punishment, which are, more structural and more long-term and sort of overarching. So in the unit, we looked at what the challenges are that those who are doing the managing face with regard to inmates challenging the structure and the rules and those who enforce them. And then what is it like really to be managed as well, right? So we looked at different types of institutional corrections. We looked at jails and we looked at prisons. Of course, this chapter on jails spends a good amount of time talking about the history of jails, which we have already looked at and in Unit 1. And of course, we want to remember that jails are local, so they tend to be run by the city or county, and they're relatively neglected. Their officers are paid less, and they are not trained at the same level that state or federal officers are trained at, and there's fewer programs. And then, of course, the population in jail is much different, which I think gets at, we come back to that in the next slide, but be familiar with this comparison between jails and prisons. And then within prisons, of course, state facilities are different than federal facilities. We have lots of different types of facilities. We also have the difference between private facilities versus public that are government run. And we looked at this chart or graph that shows us all of these different types, what people are incarcerated for, whether they are convicted or not convicted, and you see just how many people in local jails obviously are not convicted. And so the population changes over a lot more. There's much less stability, and so the experience is quite different, right? Versus here we have more stability, generally speaking, more programs. And then you also see the scale of the federal prison system, where we're talking about a pretty small number relative to their counterparts. And this is a breakout of this purple, green, and gray section over here. That's just the source for that. And here we talked a little bit about papers, so I'm not going to go back into that about your research project. Some data, again, looking at that very variable population of jails. And we also see that the biggest area of growth in the jail population in our most recent history was actually growth in the number of people who were not convicted, right? Versus those who are convicted, relatively stable. And so while the jail population and the rate of jail detention has increased, just like the prison population and the incarceration rate in prisons, the growth is driven in jails by those who are not convicted. And that means we're talking about people who are being detained pre-trial, right? And that's much, much higher in rural areas too, despite rural areas generally having lower crime rates. And we tried to explore with that link. It didn't really work that well, I think, in class. It pulled up that link on Internet Explorer, and you never want to use Internet Explorer. But that's not something that you're going to be tested over. So, the last thing that I'll point out is what these stars mean. And the stars basically mean that if we made this same chart, just looking at prisons instead of jails, you're going to see a lower percentage of females. You're going to see a higher percentage of especially Hispanic people incarcerated in federal prisons. And you're going to see this be a little bit different, of course, as well, because you're not going to have unconvicted. It's going to be all about who's convicted. And then it looks like this, oh, yeah. So this refers to, it's about this percentage. About 24% of all people who are in jail are actually state or federal inmates that the state or federal system has contracted with the local jails because they don't have room in their state or federal facilities, right? And then you also have a small percentage, 7% or so, who are not convicted, but they are being held for immigration and customs enforcement. Some issues are more commonly seen or at a higher rate in jail versus prisons, and that includes basically the population of jails has higher poverty rate. The people there are more likely to be homeless when they were detained. And they're actually more likely to have a mental illness. And so that actually, is partly and probably largely, but not entirely, a product of the high rate of homelessness. So there's some statistics there, and we're talking about both serious, quote unquote, serious mental illnesses and the broader mental illnesses that are going to include, diagnosable depression, generalized anxiety disorder, versus serious has to do with delusions, hallucinations, and things of that nature. Substance abuse rates are also higher in jails, and that relates to these factors as well. And mental health, having a mental health condition also increases the likelihood that someone is sexually victimized when they are in jail. Being LGBT also increases the likelihood of sexual victimization. This is true in jail and prison, by the way. They just are talking about that in the jail chapter. Having a mental illness also increases your likelihood of going to segregation, being in solitary confinement, of attempting and committing suicide. And of course, yes, again, these are all problems in prisons too. But there's other medical issues for folks who are incarcerated, and it's important to know that over half of people who are incarcerated have a chronic medical issue. These are all examples of chronic medical issues that have to be addressed with regular medication. And we have a mandate to provide a reasonable level of medical care to people who are incarcerated in jail or prison. That comes from the Estelle v. Gamble ruling and case that established that jail and prison systems are in violation of our constitutional rights if they are found to be deliberately indifferent to the medical issues that those in their care are experiencing. Another really important piece of legislation that relates here is the Prison Rape Elimination Act that mandated data collection in order to hopefully increase reporting of sexual assaults and harassment, as well as then lead to prosecution and punishment of those who are perpetrating it. And we are still not entirely sure of the impact that this has had, at least in terms of reducing sexual victimization. It has definitely increased reporting, but when you mandate that things get reported and you crack down on something, then we're going to get more reports. And that doesn't necessarily mean people are more likely to experience sexual victimization now than they used to before the PREA. It just means that more people are reporting. And then we looked at a lot of abuses in different cases where people died due to, often in these cases here, deliberate indifference or something that's pretty close to deliberate indifference of medical issues, often associated with mentally ill inmates in jails.